Chapter 1. The sun fell softly over the village of Lockwood, its gentle warmth brushing the ivy-covered cottages and cobbled lanes with an almost exaggerated calm. It was the sort of afternoon that seemed to have been preserved from a more gracious age, timeless, almost suspiciously so. At Greystone Hall, an Edwardian estate turned modest manor house, the scent of fresh scones and lemon drizzle wafted across the lawn, where wicker chairs had been arranged in polite formation. Lady Cynthia Fortescue, who recently returned from Bath following her late husband's passing, was hosting what the villagers called a reintroduction to society, though Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively near the edge of the party, suspected the lady merely longed to be gossiped about again. "Do take another cucumber sandwich, Reverend Bletchley," Lady Cynthia trilled, her smile brittle as porcelain. "Cook cut them specially thin." "They're divine, my lady," murmured the Reverend, dabbing his lips. His gaze, however, was not on the plate. It lingered instead on the mechanical owl perched behind her on the sundial. A strange thing, that owl. Bronze, with clockwork gears visible beneath its feathered etchings. It neither hooted nor moved, and yet it drew attention like a relic that didn't quite belong. "Oh, that old thing?" Lady Cynthia followed his eyes. "Henry bought it in Vienna. He was obsessed with automata, you know. It used to move its wings on the hour. Doesn't any more, of course. Just sits there like a sentry." "It watches," murmured Miss Marple to no one in particular, stirring her tea with careful grace. No one noticed. The guests were an expected crowd. Lockwood's blend of gentry and carefully disguised loneliness. Mr. Owen, retired solicitor, fiercely punctual. Mrs. Florence Hillier, widowed twice and persistently cheerful. The new schoolmistress, Miss Jane Allerton, pale, precise, and slightly misaligned in posture. And Colonel Nash, half deaf and always trying to remember who said what. Conversations bloomed like forced flowers, over-polished, faintly tense. "Have you met Mr. Barnaby?" Lady Cynthia called suddenly. Heads turned. A man stepped forward from the French doors, a touch too smooth in manner, too sharp in tailoring. He was younger than most, with a smile that flicked on and off like a faulty gaslight. "Barnaby Lane," he said. "I'm Lady Cynthia's new accountant, helping to untangle poor Henry's affairs." Miss Marple's gaze didn't move, but her teacup paused mid-sip. Helping, a slippery word, a word that covered too many sins. "Always a tangle estates," muttered Mr. Owen, nodding knowingly. "Indeed," Barnaby replied, "but where there's order, there's truth." Lady Cynthia laughed a little too brightly. "And truth is such a bore, isn't it? Still, it's terribly useful." A breeze stirred the hedges. Somewhere down the hill, the church bell gave a low, idle chime. Miss Allerton's gaze had strayed to the owl. "It's odd, isn't it? Why an owl?" "Henry used to say it was wisdom watching," Lady Cynthia said absently, adjusting her scarf. "But it always gave me the shivers." "I think it's charming," offered Florence Hillier. "Owls are very protective in folklore. Did you know that?" "No," said Miss Marple, setting her cup down. "But I do know they're silent hunters. They see what others don't." The conversation meandered elsewhere, to the price of butter, to the lack of eligible bachelors in the village, to whether the vicar's sermon last Sunday had gone on too long. But under the clinking of teacups and the rustle of linen skirts, something stirred, a thread of tension barely woven, but present. At 4 o'clock, Lady Cynthia excused herself. "I've the most dreadful headache. Too much chatter, I suspect." She pressed her fingers to her temple, then turned to Mr. Lane. "Barnaby, be a dear, and lock the study before you leave. I don't trust the cleaner with Henry's ledgers, of course." The guests began to filter out, the sun beginning its slow descent behind the yew trees. Miss Marple lingered as she often did, quietly, politely, the last to rise. Her eyes scanned the lawn, the owl, the way Lady Cynthia had said, "Lock the study," without glancing toward it. How odd, as if it wasn't really about the study at all. She reached into her handbag and retrieved a small notebook, its pages mostly blank, save for a few lines from Tennyson and the number 9 written twice. A page for curious things. Today, she wrote, "A Greystone owl. Clock stopped, but not forgotten. Barnaby Lane. Too confident. Headaches arrive with conversations, not guests." She closed the book gently. Across the lawn, the owl caught the dying light. For a moment, just a breath, ear seemed to glint. Chapter 2. The next morning in Lockwood arrived damp and heavy, as if the village had collectively exhaled in its sleep and woken still unsure why. Rain tapped gently on the window panes of St. Mary's Cottage, where Miss Marple sat with a half-knitted sock and a pot of black Darjeeling. She had completed 3 rows before deciding that the morning paper, delivered late, as always, was unusually light in news, save for a mention of budget cuts to the county library and a fox sighting near Mill Pond. Yet her thoughts lingered, not on foxes or lost council funds, but on Greystone Hall, and more specifically on Lady Cynthia's headache, which had vanished too swiftly, and Mr. Barnaby Lane, whose shoes had been buffed with the precision of someone determined to distract from something less polished. At precisely 10 o'clock, a knock sounded at the door. Miss Marple, without surprise, tucked away her knitting. "Florence, do come in," she said before the latch turned. Mrs. Florence Hillier stepped inside, a gust of lavender perfume preceding her. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, breathlessly, already halfway to the sitting room. "Not at all," Miss Marple said. "I've just poured the tea. It seems a poor sort of morning for anything but sitting quietly." Florence took the offered cup, but held it more than she drank from it. "Did you think Lady Cynthia seemed altered yesterday?" Miss Marple waited. "Oh, I don't mean ill," Florence continued, fluttering. "But thinner, perhaps, worn down, and her hand, when she poured the lemonade, I saw a tremor." "Grief takes many shapes," Miss Marple said mildly, "and not always the expected ones." Florence leaned in. "Do you think there's something strange about Mr. Lane?" "There are many types of strange," Miss Marple said, then added, "Which kind do you mean?" "The kind that's too well dressed." He asked, "Which kind do you mean?" "The kind that's too well dressed." He asked me how long I'd known the Fortescues, and then later asked again, but slightly differently, as though he wanted me to contradict myself. Miss Marple stirred her tea once. "And did you?" "No," Florence said, satisfied. "I was very precise." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I never doubted it." They sat in companionable silence a moment. Outside, the rain had turned to drizzle. Then Florence leaned forward, voice hushed. "I heard something this morning. Mrs. Yarrow, the laundress, she was at Greystone Hall this morning early, as she sometimes is. Said she saw the police arriving just after 8. Miss Marple's knitting needle paused mid-air. "They went round the back," Florence whispered. "Didn't knock at the front door. And Mrs. Yarrow swears she saw Lady Cynthia crying in the garden before they left." Miss Marple reached slowly for her notebook, though she did not open it. "How curious," she said. "Did she say whether the owl still sat on the sundial?" Florence blinked. "The owl? I didn't think to ask." "Never mind," Miss Marple said, setting the notebook aside. "I dare say we'll hear soon enough." By noon, the village had news moved in Lockwood, not by post or print, but by hair appointments, grocer visits, and overheard exchanges at the bakery queue. Mr. Owen, the solicitor, was seen pacing outside his cottage, muttering about protocol. Colonel Nash claimed he'd heard a scream in the night, though his wife insisted it was likely the cat. Miss Allerton, tight-lipped at the post office, dropped a stack of unsent letters when someone mentioned Greystone Hall. And Lady Cynthia, pale, veil drawn, and escorted by Barnaby Lane, was seen entering Dr. Humble's surgery at precisely 12:47. By mid-afternoon, it was official. Henry Fortescue's will had been tampered with. "He had a second draft," muttered Mr. Owen, now speaking, far too openly to anyone who'd listen. "I undated, unsigned, but it cuts out the nephew entirely, leaves everything to the widow." The nephew, Roland Fortescue, had yet to make an appearance in Lockwood. Whispers claimed he was abroad, possibly Spain, possibly under investigation for import issues, which is just another way of saying smuggling, said Florence to Miss Marple as they passed the vicarage. Miss Marple offered no opinion, but her eyes flicked briefly to the hedgerow, where a set of muddy footprints broke the otherwise neat path. "They didn't match the constable's shoes," she murmured. "Beg pardon?" Florence asked. "Nothing," Miss Marple said. "Only wondering if it's true that owls see better in the dark." That evening, while the rest of the village tucked itself in behind lace curtains and warm hearths, Miss Marple opened her notebook again, and added 3 lines were revised, but never signed. Intent versus legality. Miss Allerton's letters, unsent. Deliberately so. Mud prints, deeper on the heel. Someone lingered, she paused, and then added a 4th line. Clockwork owl, still not moving. But it's been turned. Chapter 3. The rain had passed by the next day, leaving Lockwood washed and wind-bitten. The hedges around Greystone Hall glistened under the low sun, droplets clinging like tiny secrets. At precisely 11, Miss Marple found herself walking up the gravel path toward the manor. She carried no umbrella, only a folded cardigan draped neatly over her arm, enough to justify the visit if anyone asked. After all, she had lent it to Lady Cynthia last Easter when the vicar's garden party turned unseasonably cold. A footman opened the door, new, judging by the unsure posture and a uniform 2 inches too wide. "Good morning," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I wondered if Lady Cynthia might be at home." The man hesitated, then disappeared without a word. The hall remained dim, the chandelier still shrouded in black crape from the morning weeks. Miss Marple waited with quiet patience, absorbing what others might not. The faint aroma of lemon, oil, and must, a trail of damp footprints too large to belong to Lady Cynthia, and curiously, a smear of chalk dust on the umbrella stand's edge. Lady Cynthia appeared a moment later. Her veil was gone, replaced by a fine silk scarf the colour of faded lavender. Her expression was composed, but behind it the edges trembled. "Miss Marple," she said, "how lovely of you to call. I thought you might be needing your cardigan soon," Miss Marple said, holding it up. "The evenings have turned again." Lady Cynthia offered a wan smile. "How thoughtful. Do come in. I confess, things have been somewhat unsettled." "I gathered as much," Miss Marple said, "though I won't press for details. These matters are always delicate." They moved to the drawing-room. Tea had been laid, but untouched. A single scone sat crumbling at the edge of its plate. "I haven't much appetite," Lady Cynthia admitted, "and Barnaby is terribly busy trying to make sense of the ledgers. The study's been locked most of the morning." Miss Marple stirred her tea, watching the milk cloud into delicate spirals. "How very responsible of him," she murmured, "though I do recall you asked him to lock it after the gathering. Has it remained so since?" Lady Cynthia paused. "Why, yes, I suppose it has." Miss Marple took a sip. "Curious that. I only ask because Mrs. Yarrow said the police entered through the side terrace. One would assume they'd want access to the study first, if the will was found there." Lady Cynthia didn't respond at once. She reached for the untouched scone, then set it back again. "Perhaps it had been unlocked in the meantime. I really couldn't say." Miss Marple did not press. Instead, she stood and wandered to the French doors. Outside, the owl still sat sentinel on the sundial, but now its beak pointed east, not south. "How strange," she said, almost to herself. "I always thought clockwork owls faced the rising sun." "It's been broken for years," Lady Cynthia replied. "Barnaby tried to have it repaired last autumn, but the mechanism's rusted." Miss Marple nodded. "Funny thing about rust, it preserves just as much as it destroys." Lady Cynthia looked at her sharply, but Miss Marple had already turned toward the tea. By afternoon, word had spread that Roland Fortescue, the disinherited nephew, had returned to England. He arrived in Lockwood that evening, and not quietly. Mrs. Pinkham at the Red Lion swore he demanded a private room, 2 whiskies, and a fire already roaring by the time his luggage hit the floor. Rumour had it he was furious, pale, and muttering about signatures and backdated lies. Colonel Nash claimed he passed Roland on the lane, and the young man nearly knocked him into the ditch with a carelessly turned bicycle. "I say he's a scoundrel," the colonel told anyone within earshot. "The sort who comes home to stir up trouble, not mourn the dead." At dusk, Roland Fortescue arrived at Greystone Hall. No one saw him enter, but Mrs. Yarrow, again uninvited and unseen, claimed to have heard shouting around 9. Male voices, one sharp, one deliberate. And then silence. The next morning, Mr. Owen the solicitor could be seen again at the gates, waving furiously at the constable and insisting someone had entered the study during the night. "But it was locked," the constable said. "Was it?" Owen snapped. "Then explain the broken latch and the spilled ink. Someone's been tampering. And I'll tell you something else. The second will is missing." Lady Cynthia was not at home. Mr. Barnaby Lane claimed she had gone to the coast for a day to clear her nerves. Miss Marple, hearing this from Florence Hillier over breakfast, made no comment, but in her notebook that evening she wrote, "Study, locked then not. By whom and why now?" Owl turned east. Deliberate, mechanism broken. So who touched it? Second will missing, before or after Roland's arrival. Lady Cynthia, absent at the precise moment chaos resumes. She tapped her pen once on the page, then added a single line beneath. The owl sees everything, even what no one admits. Chapter 4. The morning after the commotion at Greystone Hall, Lockwood awoke to something far more troubling than broken locks or missing documents. The schoolmistress had vanished. It was Mrs. Bramley, who sold preserves from her kitchen window, who noticed first. Every morning without fail, she told Florence Hillier later that day, Miss Allerton walks to the chattel, then down by the orchard path. But not today. Her window was still shut at 9, and the milk bottle untouched. Florence, of course, hurried straight to Miss Marple. "She's not the sort to just up and leave," she insisted. "Everything about her was measured, like a metronome." Miss Marple folded her newspaper. "And yet even a metronome stops if someone knocks it off the shelf." Together they walked to Miss Allerton's cottage, a trim, low-roofed dwelling, halfway up the hill. The garden was still, save for a single glove lying forgotten on the step. Florence bent to pick it up. "Left hand," she murmured. "That's odd. She was right-handed, wasn't she?" Miss Marple said nothing. She'd already noted the state of the door latch, locked but not secured from the inside. A small thing, unless someone had locked it behind them. The constable arrived within the hour, his notebook already half filled with town gossip rather than facts. He questioned the neighbors and peered through the windows, but found nothing amiss. No signs of struggle, no sign of forced entry. "She's a grown woman," he said with finality. "Perhaps she went to visit someone. Cousins in Exeter, maybe." Florence sniffed. "She never spoke of family." "That doesn't mean they don't exist," the constable muttered. But Miss Marple's eyes had drifted to the sideboard inside, barely visible through the window. A letter sat there, its edge caught beneath a silver letter opener. Not opened, just waiting. She said nothing, but in her notebook later she wrote, "Letter, unread, placed with care, not abandoned. Glove on step, left, behind, or left as sign." That afternoon the gossip turned bitter. Roland Fortescue had been seen again, this time outside the post office, speaking harshly with the grocer's boy, his voice loud enough for half the street to hear. "She was supposed to stay quiet," he had said. "That was the arrangement." "Who, sir?" the boy asked, puzzled. But Roland had walked off before answering. That evening Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, Barnaby Lane. He arrived just after 7, coat unbuttoned, a sheen of rain on his shoulders. Miss Marple welcomed him with her usual grace and a plate of shortbread. "I confess," he said after 2 bites, "I'm finding this village far more complex than the ledgers suggested." "That's often the case with villages," she replied. "They are tidy on the surface, but underneath they are terribly lived in." He chuckled, but the sound didn't reach his eyes. "I was hoping," he said, "that you might lend me your opinion. You see, before the second will vanish, it was kept in a drawer in the study, unlocked oddly enough. I found it 2 days ago when sorting through Henry's papers, but yesterday morning it was gone." Miss Marple stirred her tea once. "And you didn't mention it to the police?" No. I thought perhaps Lady Cynthia had moved it, but she insists she didn't even know it existed." Miss Marple watched him over the rim of her cup. People rarely admit to knowing what they've hidden. Barnaby shifted in his chair. "You don't think she took it?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that whoever removed the will did so because its contents threatened something more than inheritance, perhaps reputation, perhaps freedom." Barnaby went still. Then, "Miss Marple, what do you know of Miss Allerton?" "Only what I've observed. She's a woman of discipline, but also of nerves. She flinched when someone mentioned Vienna, which is curious. Most English women wouldn't. And she never sends her letters." Barnaby blinked. "You noticed that too?" Miss Marple smiled. "I notice many things. I find it helps." He stood suddenly uneasy. "If anything further happens, will you come to me first?" "No," Miss Marple said gently, "but I will come to the truth." After he left, she sat quietly by the hearth, pen poised. Then she wrote, "Barnaby, hiding something, but not lying, not yet. Roland's remark, the arrangement, with whom? Miss Allerton, vanishes the day the will disappears." She hesitated, then underlined one phrase. "The owl turns, the clock resets. Something is about to begin." Chapter 5. By the following morning, the village of Lockwood was gripped by the kind of quiet that only follows something gone missing. Miss Allerton's disappearance had left an odd hush over the lanes, as if the hedgerows themselves were listening for her return. Miss Marple, however, was already walking toward the schoolmistress's cottage before breakfast. She carried with her a brown paper parcel wrapped with string. It contained a small tin of honey, a well-folded shawl, and a reason to speak to the constable posted just beyond the gate. "Miss Marple," he greeted. "I'm afraid there's no update. Still no sign of Miss Allerton. I thought I'd leave this on her doorstep, in case she returns quietly." "In case she returns quietly," Miss Marple said. "You know how people are about public fuss." The constable hesitated, then stepped aside. "I'll just be a moment," she added gently. Inside, the cottage had been left tidy, but not scrubbed. A cup sat overturned in the sink, a book lay open near the hearth, and a scarf had been folded but not put away. Nothing broken, nothing panicked, except for the drawer beneath the writing desk, which had clearly been rifled through. Miss Marple approached it softly. She didn't open it. She simply looked at the corner of a page caught beneath the edge. Not the usual crisp bond of correspondence paper. Thinner, torn from a notebook. Just a sliver of ink was visible, the tail of a capital R. Miss Marple straightened and left the parcel gently by the door. Later that morning, Roland Fortescue appeared at the village green as if summoned by rumour. His overcoat was immaculate, but his eyes betrayed sleepless hours. Florence Hillier happened to be passing the sweet shop and did not waste the opportunity. "I heard you were abroad," she said lightly. "Briefly," Roland replied. "But one can't ignore family matters forever." especially when they involve missing wolves," she added, her eyes narrowing. He didn't flinch, but he didn't deny it either. "Tell me," he said after a pause, "does Miss Marple usually insert herself in legal affairs, or only when clockwork ornaments are involved?" Florence blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "Nothing," he said. "Forget I said it." But Florence, of course, would do no such thing. That evening, Miss Marple returned to Greystone Hall. This time she came not for tea, but with a question. Lady Cynthia received her in the study, a rare occurrence. The room was dimly lit, and for once the great clock on the mantel had stopped ticking. "Miss Marple," Lady Cynthia said, brushing a hand through her hair, "I've no news, if that's what you've come for." "Not quite," Miss Marple replied, "though I was hoping to inquire about the writing desk, the one in Henry's room." Lady Cynthia looked up sharply. "What of it?" "It's been moved, only by a few inches, but enough to show where the Rudge nap is pressed. Curious, isn't it? One doesn't usually move such things, not unless searching beneath." Lady Cynthia said nothing. Miss Marple continued softly, "It might explain why someone returned after the gathering, why the study door was found unlocked the next morning. Perhaps someone remembered something small, easily overlooked." Cynthia's fingers tightened around the armrest. "What are you suggesting?" "Nothing, my dear. Only that a missing will often lead people to strange corners, especially if something was tucked beneath the desk drawer. A letter, perhaps, or a threat." A long silence followed. Then Lady Cynthia exhaled. "Henry, he wrote things down, all his suspicions. He'd become paranoid, really, convinced someone was forging his signature, planning to contest the estate. He thought it was Roland, I wasn't sure." "Did he ever confront him?" "Once, but it was vague, hints and questions. Afterward, Henry said he'd hidden a note, just in case." "And did you find it?" "I searched," Cynthia said quietly. "But no." Miss Marple nodded. "That night the wind howled through the narrow streets of Lockwood. At midnight the village was woken by the sound of glass shattering, somewhere near the chapel. The constable arrived within 10 minutes. The window to the old crypt beneath the hill had been smashed. Nothing taken, nothing left, except one thing. Single sheet of paper folded 4 times wedged beneath a stone ledge. It was a letter, unsigned but unmistakable in its tone. "She knows. The woman at the school. I told her too much. If she speaks, everything will fall apart. I've done all I can, but if this reaches you, it means I've failed. Burn the owl. It's the only thing they can't afford to lose." The letter was handed to the inspector, but a copy, carefully transcribed in looping handwriting, was already in Miss Marple's notebook. Beneath it she wrote, "Burn the owl," a metaphor or literal instruction. If she speaks, but she disappeared. Someone feared her voice. They can't afford to lose the owl. So what does it hide? Chapter 6. The following morning dawned clear but cold, as though the village itself had withdrawn into suspicion. Even the bird-song felt sparse, restrained, like a whisper behind closed curtains. Miss Marple stood at her garden gate, clipping back a stubborn rose vine. when Florence Hillier appeared up the lane with purpose in every step. "They've cordoned off the chapel," she announced breathlessly. "Inspector Leslie arrived from the county, brought in 2 officers and a spade." "A spade?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Ground disturbance," they said, "under the east window, the same one with the broken glass." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Not many people buried under that side. It's too shallow." Florence blinked. "You mean you—" "Mrs. Cook's husband tried to plant a rose bush there in 1937. Couldn't get more than 6 inches before hitting stone. He complained for weeks." Florence stared. "Do you remember everything?" "Only the useful parts," Miss Marple said. "Tell me, has anyone seen Miss Allerton?" Florence hesitated. "Still missing, though I overheard Reverend Bletchley speaking with the inspector. He claims Miss Allerton came to him for spiritual counsel last week." "Did she?" "He says so, though the Reverend can't remember what she said. Only that she looked afraid." Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. Instead, she set down her shears and reached for her basket. "I think I'll take a walk to Greystone. The roses there are more cooperative." Florence squinted. "Or perhaps it's not roses you're after." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One must check the shadows if one hopes to find the source of the light." At Greystone Hall, the atmosphere had shifted again. The front door was ajar, the hall unusually quiet. A faint mechanical ticking echoed from somewhere deep within the house. It wasn't the grandfather clock. Miss Marple followed the sound through a side corridor and out into the garden. There, standing by the sundial, was Barnaby Lane, shirt sleeves rolled, brow furrowed, a small toolkit open beside him. He looked up as she approached. "Ah, Miss Marple, you're just in time for the dissection." "Of the owl?" she asked. He nodded. "It always bothered me. Not just that it didn't work, but that it was sealed. Someone went to great effort to close it permanently. Hidden screws, welded seams. That's not typical for decorative automata. What did you find inside?" He gestured. The owl had been carefully opened along the seam at its chest. Inside, a small cavity, empty, except for 2 objects. One, a slip of folded parchment sealed in wax. The other, a key, brass, old, no label. Miss Marple crouched to examine them. "Did you open the parchment?" she asked. "Not yet," Barnaby said. "Felt wrong somehow, as if it ought to be read by someone else." She picked it up delicately, examined the wax. Red, imprinted with a crescent shape. Not a family crest. Something else. A personal seal. She slipped the parchment into her handbag. "Thank you, Mr. Zane. May I keep this for now?" He hesitated, then nodded. "There's more, though," he added. "A slot in the back, just above the perch, as if for a second mechanism, a trigger perhaps. But it's missing. Removed deliberately, possibly, or never installed." Miss Marple nodded once. "I think you've done enough with it for now. Best to leave some mysteries intact until they choose to reveal themselves." As she turned to go, Barnaby called after her. "Do you think the owl was meant to watch something, or someone?" "I think," Miss Marple said without looking back, "it was meant to protect something, or someone. There's a difference." Back at St. Mary's Cottage, Miss Marple laid the key and the parchment on her table. She regarded them for a long moment before unsealing the wax. The parchment read, If I do not survive this dispute, let the contents of the brass box beneath the chapel decide the matter. The key is here. The truth lies not in the paper trail, but in the pattern of betrayal. There was no name, no date, only one sentence more, faint and cramped along the edge. She warned me, but I didn't listen. Miss Marple closed the letter gently. Later that evening, the inspector arrived at her door. He looked tired, dust on his coat and boots. "We found something," he said without preamble. "Under the chattel window. A tin box, buried no more than a foot deep, and it's locked, sealed more like. We'll open it at the station tomorrow." Miss Marple simply offered him tea. As he sipped, she asked, "Was Miss Allerton's name inside the chapel registry?" He looked up. "Yes, signed in 3 days ago. Her name was the only one listed that morning." "And was it in her handwriting?" The inspector hesitated. "You think it wasn't?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that someone wanted it to look like she walked in and never walked out." She rose and crossed to the window, where the last light of evening touched the garden. Out on the sundial, the owl had been reassembled, its head now pointed deliberately west. Miss Marple narrowed her eyes. West, toward the hill, toward the schoolhouse, toward whatever came next. Chapter 7. By morning, word had spread through Lockwood like smoke from a slow-burning fire. Something had been unearthed beneath the chapel, something locked, something worth guarding. The villagers, sensing a story too thick for tea-time chatter, clustered in 2s and 3s around the green, whispering names and theories as though the air itself might betray them. At the police station, the tin box from the chapel sat unopened on the inspector's desk. It was rectangular, weather-worn, sealed not just with age but intention. A seam of wax ringed the lid, hardened into the grain of the metal. Miss Marple arrived without needing to be summoned. She stepped into the station with her usual soft presence, yet the room seemed to fall quiet around her. "You brought the key?" the inspector asked. She nodded and laid the brass key gently on the blotter. The owl gave it up rather reluctantly. He inserted it into the lock. It turned with surprising ease. The lid lifted. Inside, papers, folded meticulously. A packet of checks, some blank, some made out in Henry Fortescue's careful hand, and beneath them a photograph, faded but unmistakable. It was Miss Allerton, not in Lockwood, not in her modest wool cardigan, or beside the chapel path. No, she stood in a lavish salon, arm-linked with a man the inspector didn't recognize. Miss Marple, however, did. "That's Emil Schreiber," she said softly. "A name not spoken aloud since 1938. The inspector blinked. "Who?" "A financier, Swiss, connected to certain, let us say, discreet channels in Austria. And Lady Cynthia's late husband was said to have done business abroad, was he not?" The inspector frowned. "Are you suggesting this is blackmail?" "I'm suggesting that Miss Allerton was not always a schoolmistress, and that the second may not be the only thing someone wanted to disappear. Also, inside the box, a notebook, its pages covered in Henry Fortescue's sharp, slanted hand. Most of it financial shorthand. But one entry, dated only March, read, 'If Cynthia's fears are right, I've been deceived on all sides. Lane is watching. The woman from Austria is too careful. I must prepare. They'll come for the owl if they know what it contains." The inspector sat back. He knew someone was coming for him. "Or at least for what he hid," Miss Marple murmured. "There's a difference." She scanned the room. "And where is Mr. Lane this morning?" "Gone," the inspector said, grimly. "Didn't return to the inn last night. His bags are still there, but no sign of him." "And Lady Cynthia?" "She left a note saying she was unwell, that she's gone to her sister's cottage by the coast." Miss Marple smiled faintly. 2 disappearances in one night. Very neat. That afternoon, the owl was stolen. Greystone Hall's gardener, arriving to tend the roses, found the sundial bare. No broken pieces, no disturbed soil, only the owl's absence, and the faint impression of fingers on the stone base. Miss Marple arrived minutes later, summoned not by the police, but by the rhythm of events themselves. "The owl was never meant to be kept," she said to the constable. "It was a message, not a memory." "But why steal it now?" he asked. "The key was already taken, the box already found." "Because someone doesn't know what else might have been hidden inside it," Miss Marple said. "And fear, when mixed with ignorance, leads to desperation." That evening, a letter arrived at St. Mary's Cottage. No return address. Thin paper. The ink faint but precise. You must not trust her. The woman behind the letters, she's done this before. Vienna letters, she's done this before. Vienna, 1937. Lausanne, 1941. She was never a victim. She orchestrates silence. Be careful. It was unsigned. Miss Marple read it twice, then added it to her notebook beside the photo of Miss Allerton. She circled 2 words, Lausanne and silence, then wrote beneath blackmail. But who initiated it, and for what purpose? Fortescue feared betrayal, but by whom? Lane, Cynthia, or someone hiding in plain sight? The owl is missing, but someone believes it still contains power. What did they leave behind? She tapped her pen once, then underlined one final phrase. Miss Allerton's absence is too careful to be a disappearance. Chapter 8. It was shortly after noon when Miss Marple received a second letter. No return address again, no signature. But this one bore different handwriting, slanted, rapid, and trembling. He didn't deserve to die afraid. I warned him, but I couldn't stop it. The owl was only part of it. The rest is buried deeper, beneath the silence. You mustn't let the others rewrite what happened. Miss Marple folded it carefully and slipped it between the pages of her notebook. A whisper from the past coming through trembling ink. That same afternoon, Inspector Leslie summoned her to the police station again. "We found Lane," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Or rather, he was found in a room at the Chelmsford Inn. He's alive, but unconscious. Drugged, the doctor says. Something slipped into his drink. Deliberate? Undoubtedly. The timing is too precise. He checked in under a false name, claimed he needed to be somewhere no one would look. But someone did." Miss Marple sat down, hands neatly folded in her lap. "And the owl? No sign of it. Then it's still in play," she murmured, "even if what it once held is gone." Leslie raised an eyebrow. "You think it's symbolic?" "I think," she replied slowly, It's a distraction. The real secret is no longer in the object. It's in the people who touched it. Back in Lockwood, the weather had turned again. Grey clouds pressed low, as if urging the village into quiet. Windows shut early, doors latched with more care. Miss Marple took a different path home, one that passed the abandoned railway siding, long overgrown, where foxglove now grew wild along the tracks. Something had been bothering her for days. Not a clue, not quite a fact. A conversation, a silence. Actually, she arrived at the schoolhouse near dusk. The door was unlocked inside. Dust clung to the windows. Chalk sat unused on the board. And on the teacher's desk, a single object stood out against the emptiness. A ledger. Not a school register, but a logbook, bound in dark leather. Miss Marple opened it. Entries began months ago. Names, codes, occasional foreign cities, transfers, payments. One entry caught her eye, marked in red ink. C. Fortescue, owl retrieved, papers pending, silence purchased. She closed the book softly. So it hadn't just been about Henry Fortescue's will. It had been about leverage, and Miss Allerton had kept records. But why keep them in a schoolhouse? She turned, and startled slightly. Miss Allerton stood in the doorway. Her coat was rain-slicked, her face pale, worn, but her eyes were clear. "Sigel shouldn't be here," she said. "I imagine that's true for both of us," Miss Marple replied. "You've been hiding, not missing. I needed time to decide what to do with what I knew." "And what have you decided?" Miss Allerton hesitated. Then, that it's too late to undo it, but not too late to expose it. She walked past Miss Marple and lifted the logbook. Her fingers trembled slightly, but she didn't let go. "Henry didn't know everything," she said, "but he suspected enough. He wasn't the only one involved in the Vienna account. Cynthia knew. She was the intermediary. And the owl? A delivery device. Once it held more than a key. Before it was sealed, Fortescue didn't trust banks. He hid evidence in mechanical things. The owl was one of them. "Why did you leave?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Because I thought I was next. Henry was dead. The second will gone. And then I found the photo, the ones in the box. That wasn't supposed to surface. But it did." Miss Allerton nodded. "And I knew whoever buried that box would come looking for what else I had. So I ran." "You sent the letters." "Only the second one. The first wasn't mine." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Then someone else is still playing their hand." That night Miss Allerton returned to the station with Miss Marple. She handed the logbook to the inspector, quietly and without ceremony. "There's more," she said. "A second volume, hidden in Henry's study, behind the false back of the clock. He told me once, in a moment of weakness. The inspector dispatched a constable at once." Miss Marple lingered by the window. "It's unravelling," she said softly. "But we must be careful. Truth untied from its secrecy tends to cut deeply." The inspector looked up. "Do you believe, Miss Allerton?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that she regrets her part. But whether that regret came before or after someone nearly silenced her, that remains to be seen." She turned back to the village beyond the glass. The shadows were growing longer, but shadows, as she well knew, only fall when something solid stands in the way of the light. Chapter 9. The constable returned from Greystone Hall just past midnight. The streets of Lockwood were empty by then. The village hushed beneath a low-hanging fog, but the lights in the police station still burned, and Miss Marple, knitting untouched in her lap, sat quietly as the door opened and the young man stepped inside. "Well?" Inspector Leslie asked. The constable held up a faded marbled ledger, its edges dust-worn but intact. It was where she said it would be, behind the long-case clock in the study, a hidden compartment behind the chimes. Took a bit of fiddling, but it opened. He set the book down. Miss Marple leaned forward. The second ledger was less detailed than the one hidden in the schoolhouse. Less names, more reflections. Henry Fortescue's handwriting, drooping and occasionally erratic, filled each page like a man scribbling against time. Near the final pages, a sequence caught her eye. "Cynthia weeps, but I do not trust her tears. Lane is careful, too careful. I begin to think the owl must go. She asked if I destroyed it. I told her yes, but I go. She asked if I destroyed it. I told her yes, but I haven't. It watches still. Perhaps it's foolish, this game of clocks and keys. Perhaps I should simply let the past rot. But the Austrian woman's silence unnerves me. She knows more than she claims. And if Roland returns, God help us all." Miss Marple tapped her fingers gently against the desk. "Henry was frightened," she said. "Not of exposure, but of betrayal from within. He knew the noose was tightening, yet he couldn't tell where it was hung." The inspector closed the book and exhaled slowly. So everyone had something to hide. Cynthia, Lane, Miss Allerton, and Roland. Miss Marple looked toward the fogged window. "Roland," she said softly, "has remained strangely peripheral for someone supposedly disinherited." The inspector frowned. He showed up just in time for the will's disappearance, argued with the gardener, fought with the grocer's boy, left no alibi for the night the box was buried. He has the temperament for panic, but not strategy. "Still," Miss Marple said, "he knew enough to arrive when he did. He was chasing something, but I suspect it wasn't inheritance. It was erasure." "Erasure? Of his involvement," she said, "or his association with someone else's crimes?" By mid-morning, a new revelation shook Lockwood. The gardener at Greystone Hall, while clearing frost off the sundial base, discovered a scrap of burnt parchment jammed between the pedestal stones. Only part of it remained legible, but the ink was unmistakably Henry Fortescue's. Not the original document. A copy, perhaps, but the wording lacks precision. Lane says it's sufficient. I disagree. Cynthia's pressure grows. The note had been partially torched, perhaps in haste, perhaps in panic. Miss Marple examined it later at the station, her expression unreadable. "Someone tried to destroy a forgery," she murmured. "Likely the second will. It would explain why it vanished, why it was never produced officially. Henry saw through it." "And they hid the remains beneath the owl?" the inspector asked. "No," she said. "That was panic afterward, a last-ditch effort to obscure that it ever existed." The inspector folded his arms. "We have a motive now. Forgery and blackmail. But who had the most to lose?" Miss Marple closed her notebook and rose. "Let's ask the person whose," said the least. She arrived at Florence Hillier's cottage just past 3. The lace curtains twitched before the door opened. "Jane," Florence said, a touch too brightly, "do come in. I've just made scones, though they're not my best." "I won't stay long," Miss Marple said, stepping inside. "Only wanted to ask a simple question." "Oh? Why did you lie about the milk bottle?" Florence blinked. What? You said Miss Atherton's bottle was untouched the morning she vanished." "But the dairyman swore she took it in herself. I asked him." Florence's hands twisted in her apron. "I must have misremembered." "You don't misremember details," Miss Marple said gently. "You notice everything. So either you were misled, or you were protecting someone." Silence. Then Florence sighed. "Cynthia begged me. She was unraveling. Said she needed time to find something before the police came poking. I didn't know about the will or the owl. I just thought she needed rest." "Did she tell you where she was going?" "She didn't say, but I knew she wouldn't stay gone long. Cynthia hates being out of control." Miss Marple touched her wrist lightly. "Thank you, Florence. I don't think you understood what she was running from, but you've helped all the same." That evening, back at St. Mary's Cottage, Miss Marple jotted 3 quiet entries. Ledger confirms Henry suspected everyone close. Yet he still hid the truth in plain sight. Burnt parchment, Justio's attempt to erase false will. Copy, not original. But why burn it before confirming its exposure? Florence lied for Cynthia. So where is Cynthia now? And what else did she take with her? She paused, then underlined one final note. The owl may have held secrets, but someone held the owl, and they still do. Chapter 10. The next morning, the fog refused to lift. It pressed against windows like a presence, dulling the village into silence. The lanes of Lockwood were empty by 8, though the clocks rang the hour faithfully, as if unaware that something was missing. By 9, it became clear what or who it was. Lady Cynthia Fortescue was gone. Not simply absent, not vaguely away. Gone. Her sister, contacted at the coast, claimed she'd never arrived. The train station held no record of her departure. Her bedroom at Greystone Hall was undisturbed, save for the open wardrobe and the faintest trace of perfume on a shawl left behind. Her car remained in the drive, her bags gone. The inspector stood with Miss Marple outside the house, both facing the gravel path that led nowhere in particular. "She didn't run," he said. "She vanished." "No one truly vanishes," Miss Marple replied. "Not unless someone else is helping them." Back inside, the inspector questioned the housekeeper. She knew nothing. The cook had heard footsteps around midnight, but assumed it was Barnaby Lane. Except Lane, still recovering in Chelmsford, had not returned. Only one thing was out of place. In the downstairs study, the mechanical clock owl, which had been stolen, then mysteriously returned the night before, was back on the sundial. But this time its beak pointed straight at the house. Miss Marple approached it slowly. The gears had been turned again, fresh scratches near the base, and tucked beneath the statue, barely noticeable beneath a dislodged pebble. A button, ivory, ornate, from a woman's coat. Cynthia's? the inspector asked. Miss Marple turned it over. Not likely. This is Austrian hornwork. Miss Allerton wore something similar her first week here. They both fell silent. Then the inspector said, "What if Cynthia never left the house?" Later that afternoon, a search of Greystone Hall began in earnest. Every cupboard, crawl space, and cellar. The grounds, too, though it had begun to drizzle, again turning the garden soil soft and concealing. Nothing. Until the gardener's spade struck something beneath the rose arch, beside the wall. It wasn't a body. It was a tin box, smaller than the chapel's. Inside, another folded letter. No wax seal this time. Just ink, rushed uneven. They want me quiet, but I've hidden the truth in the only place I trust. If I don't return, it means she found me first. There was no signature, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Cynthia's. Miss Marple read it 3 times before handing it to the inspector. She was afraid, she said quietly. Not of guilt, but of exposure. She wanted someone to find the truth, but not yet. Not until it was too late for anyone to stop it. The inspector looked up. You think she's dead? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she asked, Where is Miss Allerton now? Back at the schoolhouse. Said she needed rest. Miss Marple nodded once. Then I'll visit her. I find people tend to speak more clearly when they think they're safe. At the schoolhouse, the air smelled faintly of ink and dust. Miss Allerton sat by the fireplace, a shawl around her shoulders, a cup of untouched tea beside her. You've come to accuse me, she said without looking up. I've come to ask one question, Miss Marple said, setting her handbag gently on the table. Why did Cynthia's letter mention you, but never name you? Miss Allerton exhaled slowly. Because she was trying to protect me, she said. Even at the end, she thought she owed me that much. Owed you? Miss Marple's tone was gentle. Miss Allerton stood slowly. We weren't strangers, you know. Not in Vienna, not in Lausanne. We worked together for the same causes, but our methods. She trailed off. Cynthia believed in erasure. I believed in preservation. And Henry, well, he found both sides useful until it turned on him. You forged the second will, Miss Marple said calmly. Yes. You attempted to burn it. Yes. You drugged Lane. A pause. No, Miss Allerton said. That wasn't me. That was panic. From someone else. And Cynthia? Miss Allerton's voice dropped. I don't know, truly. I confronted her after the ledger was found. She refused to run. Said she'd buried enough secrets already. Said it was time for someone else to carry the burden. Miss Marple stared at her. Then she's dead. Don't know, Miss Allerton repeated. But if she is, I didn't do it. I have enough guilt to bear without that. Miss Marple stood, quietly gathering her things. At the door, she turned. You kept the owl, didn't you? Miss Allerton didn't reply. Miss Marple nodded once. It's a curious thing, Miss Allerton. Owls don't blink. They stare, even when everything else has turned away. Chapter 11. By the next morning the fog had thickened, blanketing Lockwood in a pale hush that made even footsteps feel intrusive. The search for Lady Cynthia continued, though the inspector's face said more than the official statements. The constables combed the woods near the western edge of the village, where the trees grew too close together and the paths forgot themselves. Still no sign. But Miss Marple wasn't searching the woods. She was standing at the vicarage gate, watching the Reverend Bletchley polish the hinges on his bicycle. "You knew Miss Allerton before she arrived in Lockwood," she said without preamble. The Reverend stiffened. "We corresponded briefly during the war, refugee matters. She listed you as her only English contact when she left Vienna," Miss Marple said, pulling a thin paper from her handbag. "I found this in the chapel registry archive." Looked down at the page, the color in his face retreating. "She needed a sponsor," he said finally. "Someone to vouch for her background. She'd been with an aid organization, quiet work, dangerous work. I admired her convictions." "And Cynthia Fortescue?" "I didn't know her then, but you know her now." The Reverend looked away. "She confessed to you, didn't she?" Miss Marple continued. "The night before she vanished. That's why you told the inspector she came for spiritual counsel." "She said she was tired," he murmured, "of secrets, of being used and using others. She said she'd hidden something that mattered more than the owl, more than the ledger, more than any of it. But she wouldn't say what." Miss Marple nodded. "Because it wasn't a thing. It was a person." That afternoon, a boy delivering eggs to the Red Lion made a quiet discovery. Behind the stables, in a patch of flattened grass, he found a woman's brooch, a familiar one worn often by Lady Cynthia. It was caught in a tangle of ivy, the clasp bent, the pearl chipped. Miss Marple examined it at the station. "She struggled," she said softly. "Not violently, but enough to mark her passage." "Then someone dragged her?" the inspector asked. "No," Miss Marple replied. "Someone guided her. A woman wouldn't lose a brooch like this unless she let herself be taken somewhere, under duress, but not force." The inspector frowned. Then who was she following? Miss Marple didn't answer. She was already drawing a map in her mind. The brooch, the owl's orientation, the chapel, the schoolhouse, and now the inn. That evening, Miss Allerton was gone. Her room at the schoolhouse was empty, the bedding neat, the fire cold, but her handbag had been left behind, open, unzipped. Inside was the second ledger, the one retrieved from behind the grandfather clock. It had been rewritten, or rather, reordered. Pages torn from their binding, reshuffled, restitched with red thread. And in the margin of several entries, a new set of initials had been added. J.M. Miss Marple's own. The message was clear. Someone wanted to frame her, or at the very least redirect the trail toward her. The inspector found her at the garden gate, watching the mist roll across the green. "She's running again," he said, "or she's been taken. Either way, we've lost her." "We haven't," Miss Marple replied. He looked at her. "You sound certain." "She's left a trail, not of breadcrumbs, but of guilt, and guilt never covers its tracks well." Later, that night, Miss Marple stood again before the sundial. The owl had not moved, but someone had been there. A scrap of dark fabric was caught beneath the pedestal. She pulled it free. A sleeve lining, torn clean, with a small embroidered name, Schreiber. Miss Marple folded it slowly, hands steady despite the cold. The past was circling, and the hour had always been pointing to more than direction. It had been pointing to identity. Chapter 12. The fog lifted by morning, revealing Larkwood in all its damp clarity. But with the clouds gone, something else remained, a stillness that wasn't peace. It was expectation. Miss Marple moved carefully through the day, avoiding unnecessary conversation, watching faces rather than listening to them. Fear had begun to settle behind the eyes of the villagers. Fear not of violence, but of consequence. At the post office, Mr. Owen the solicitor fumbled with his change. At the bakery, Mrs. Hillier forgot her order. Even the vicar, usually unshakable, left his cassock unbuttoned. But Miss Marple wasn't watching them any more. She was watching Roland Fortescue. He'd reappeared that morning, soaked and sullen, at the Red Lion. Claimed he'd been visiting a solicitor in Cheltenham. Couldn't produce a receipt. Had no alibi for the night Lady Cynthia vanished. The inspector cornered him just after noon. "Where is she, Mr. Fortescue?" he asked. "You argued with her. You threatened her inheritance, and then she disappeared." Roland rubbed his jaw, eyes ringed with sleeplessness. "I didn't touch her," he said. "I was trying to convince her to give me the papers. That's all." "What papers?" "She said she had proof. That Henry's death wasn't natural. That he'd been poisoned, but the records were missing." The inspector paused. "Poisoned?" Roland nodded slowly. "She was terrified. Said someone wanted the owl destroyed because it had been used once, long ago, to conceal a file. Something lethal." Miss Marple, listening from the doorway, closed her notebook. Later that afternoon, she asked to examine the owl one final time. It had been retrieved and secured in the station's evidence cabinet, still unassuming, still silent. She turned it gently in her hands. No false compartment remained. But beneath the base, something hadn't been noticed before. A set of initials, worn, shallow, but unmistakable. "Yes, Emil Schreiber," she murmured. The inspector, leaning over her shoulder, frowned. "So, it wasn't just an heirloom?" "No," she said. "It was his, reclaimed by Fortescue, hidden in plain sight, a trophy and a warning. The mechanism mattered less than what it once held." "And now? Now it holds nothing," she said. "But it still frightens people, because some secrets don't need to be seen to be felt." That evening Miss Marple paid a final visit to Miss Allerton. She found her at the chapel, seated near the rear pew, her hands clasped, not in prayer, but in thought. "You weren't supposed to come back," Miss Marple said quietly. "I never truly left," Miss Allerton replied. "I only watched from the margins." Miss Marple joined her in the pew. "You stitched my initials into the second ledger," she said calmly. Miss Allerton didn't deny it. "I needed time," she said. "Time to decide who could be trusted." "Then why implicate me?" "Because I knew you'd find your way through it. I needed the trail to stay warm. And you, well, you don't frighten easily." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "But I do worry about truth becoming performance, about people rewriting their pasts into something more forgivable." Miss Allerton looked down. "We were all rewriting something." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Even Cynthia?" The silence that followed wasn't hesitation. It was regret. She didn't plan to run, Miss Allerton said. She planned to confess. To what? To everything. Her part in the Vienna operations, her use of the owl, the forged will. She'd written it all out, but she couldn't decide whether to deliver it to the police or to you. Where is it now? I don't know. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Then she said, You called the vial a detail earlier when Roland mentioned it, but no one mentioned the vial until now. Miss Allerton froze, very slightly. Then, I assumed. No, Miss Marple said gently. You remembered. The chapel clock ticked once, then twice. I didn't. Poison Henry, Miss Allerton whispered. But you watched him die, Miss Marple said, and you said nothing, because you believed he deserved it, for what he'd done to all of you. To Vienna, to Cynthia. I didn't kill him, Miss Allerton repeated. No, Miss Marple said again, but you covered for the one who did. Another silence. But this one cracked. She didn't mean to, Miss Allerton whispered. It was supposed to scare him. She said just a drop, just enough to make him talk. But he never woke up. And when she saw what she'd done, she buried herself, Miss Marple finished, in secrets, in silence, until there was nothing left to hide behind. Outside the chapel, the wind stirred gently through the grass. Miss Marple rose. Where is the confession? She asked, softly. Miss Allerton reached into her coat and withdrew a single page, folded once, signed, dated. Don't let it die in the dark, she said. Miss Marple took it with a nod. I won't. Chapter 13. The following day broke crisp and windless, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The fog had lifted, but what remained was clearer than ever. Lockwood was watching itself. At the vicarage hall, under the modest pretence of a community reconciliation meeting, the inspector, the Reverend Bletchley, Mr. Owen, Florence Hillier, and Miss Allerton were all present. Even Roland Fortescue, red-eyed and sullen, stood in the back with a cup of untouched tea. Miss Marple arrived last. She took her time removing her gloves, settling into the chair near the hearth, not at the head of the room, not beside the inspector, but just near enough to be heard. I do hope you'll forgive the informality, she said pleasantly, but I've always found the truth prefers tea and hearthlight over interrogation rooms and cold benches. The inspector gave a single nod. The others remained silent. Miss Marple placed a folded paper on the table. Cynthia Fortescue's confession, though she left it unopened. I've spent the last few days collecting what might seem to be clutter. A burnt brooch, 2 ledgers, a torn lining, a letter from a chapel box, and a mechanical owl that watched more than it turned. But every item had one thing in common, fear. She let the word sit. The owl, you see, was never meant to deceive. It was meant to guard. Henry Fortescue believed in symbols. He thought if he hid the key to his secrets inside something impossible to ignore, no one would dare open it. But, of course, they did. Her eyes swept the room. Henry wasn't poisoned randomly. He wasn't even the target, not at first. The original intention, I believe, was leverage, a warning. A small dose slipped into his tea or tonic, enough to frighten him into naming names. But he was already too fragile, and he died. Roland shifted. Miss Allerton did not, and Cynthia, Miss Marple said gently, carried that weight alone until it crushed her. She turned to Florence. You lied to protect her, Florence. You didn't know Florence. You didn't know everything, but you knew she was unraveling. You wanted to give her a head start. Florence looked away. And Miss Allerton, Miss Marple continued, you forged the second will, not to claim the inheritance, but to draw suspicion away from Cynthia. You knew it wouldn't stand legal scrutiny, but it muddied the trail, made the motive harder to trace. Miss Allerton's lips parted, then closed again. You protected her because of what she meant to you. In Vienna, in Lausanne. Because secrets shared in crisis bind people longer than truth ever could. Miss Marple reached into her handbag and withdrew the scrap of torn sleeve. This, however, did not belong to Cynthia. It belonged to Emil Schreiber, a name buried in Henry's ledger, a name that haunted 3 of you. She turned to the Reverend. You sponsored Miss Allerton's escape, but you didn't disclose everything, did you? Reverend Bletchley paled. She begged me, he said faintly. She said revealing their past would destroy them both. I thought it was over, that she was safe here. She wasn't hiding, Miss Marple said. She was waiting, because Cynthia's confession wasn't just guilt, it was a warning that the past was circling again. Then she placed one more item on the table, the button from the owl's pedestal. I returned to the sundial last night. The owl had moved again. This time it faced north. It always faced what it feared. And last night it pointed directly at the schoolhouse. Silence. Then Miss Allerton stood. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was tired. You'll never find the body, she said. She came to me that night. She was broken. She wanted to turn herself in. She thought the confession was enough. It was, Miss Marple said gently. But it wasn't to me, Miss Allerton continued. I'd spent my whole life protecting her. And when she said she was ready to throw herself at the mercy of the law, I told her no, that I wouldn't allow it. And then, the inspector asked. She drank the tea I gave her. That's all. There was no fight. She knew. Where is she? Miss Allerton stared into the fireplace, where the owl used to watch. Under the garden stones, beside the wall, beneath the frost. The inspector stood, but Miss Marple remained seated. She made one mistake, she said softly. Miss Allerton looked up. She thought silence was mercy. But in the end, silence only made the truth harder to hear. Chapter 15. The garden stones at Greystone Hall were lifted just before dawn. Beneath them, exactly where Miss Allerton had said, they found Cynthia Fortescue. No signs of violence, no resistance, just stillness. Her body wrapped in a blanket, her face turned toward the east. In her hand was a small key, later confirmed to be the original for the owl. The inspector read Cynthia's confession aloud in private, then submitted it to the Crown Office. I poisoned Henry, not to kill him, but to frighten him into revealing where he kept the original ledgers. I needed the names erased before they were used against us. He was weak. He collapsed before I could stop it. I thought if I forged the will, I could control the fallout. But everything unraveled. The owl knew too much. I'm tired of lying, there was no doubt. The case was closed. Miss Allerton was taken into custody without resistance. She walked beside the constable with the composure of someone who had long rehearsed the moment. No trial would follow. Only a quiet, indefinite commitment to a secure hospital. The court agreed. She was no longer dangerous, just broken. At St. Mary's Cottage, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The room was quieter now, the radio silent. The air felt still, as though the house itself was letting out a breath. Florence Hillier visited a few days later. She left a terrible mess, Florence said, but I suppose in her own way she thought it was cleaner than truth. Truth isn't tidy, Miss Marple said. It never was. It just pretends to be until someone pulls the curtain. And the owl? Returned to the inspector, Miss Marple said. It will sit in the archives. No gears, no secrets left to keep, just brass and silence. Florence hesitated. Do you think people will remember what happened? People always remember the parts that suit them, Miss Marple said. The rest fades. She stood and walked to the window. Outside, the sundial was bare now. The owl's pedestal stood empty, its shadow casting across the grass like the hour hand of a stopped clock. There was a moment, Miss Marple said, when I wondered if Cynthia would confess. She stood on the edge of it for so long, but in the end she couldn't bear to live in the shadow of what she'd done. She wanted to be punished? Florence asked. No, Miss Marple said quietly. She wanted to be understood. That afternoon the inspector visited. He placed a thin file on the table. All tied up, he said, clean as we can make it. The Crown will quietly acknowledge Henry Fortescue's wartime dealings. No formal charges for the dead. Miss Marple opened the file. Inside were the names from the ledger, the Austrian connections, the trail Henry had tried so desperately to bury, and that the owl had guarded for decades. What will they do with it? Archive it. Redact what's necessary. The rest will sit in a cabinet no one opens, Miss Marple nodded. They always do. Before leaving, the inspector hesitated. Miss Marple, why did you keep going? After all the lies, all the diversions, why did you keep looking? She smiled softly, because the owl never blinked. He looked at her, puzzled. The owl, she said again, wasn't just a hiding place. It was a metaphor, a reminder that something, someone, was always watching, even when the rest of us looked away. She didn't say more. She didn't need to. That evening she took out her notebook and turned to the final page. Her handwriting, always careful, was neater than usual. Final notes. Greystone case. Henry Fortescue feared betrayal, but contributed to it. Cynthia chose silence as penance. It became her prison. Miss Allerton used truth to protect others, and in doing so, lost herself. The owl was not a weapon. It was a mirror. Justice was served quietly, not with triumph, but with truth. She closed the book. Across the garden, the sundial stood untouched, the pedestal empty, the shadows long. Another day would come, another secret perhaps. But for now, Lockwood was still, and Miss Marple sat by the fire, content not with victory, but with understanding.